Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, and so are the myths around it. We hear AI described as an all-knowing mind, an unstoppable force, something beyond human control. But these stories don't just shape how we imagine AI. They shape the laws we pass, the policies we write, and who gets held accountable or doesn't. So if AI isn't magic, but a set of tools that people build and deploy, what happens when it's governed by myth instead of reality? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. I want to welcome you to today's book talk. In AI Tools, Not Gods, Caroline DeCock cuts through the hype to show how a handful of seductive narratives have come to dominate AI policy and how replacing them with evidence-based thinking can protect people, support innovation, and hold real actors accountable. Caroline will be in discussion with tech writer Glyn Moody, who wrote Walled Culture. As we get started here today, I'd like to welcome Brewster Kale, the Internet Archive's digital librarian. Now, Brewster wrote the foreword to today's book, so has a lot of thoughts and interests to share on this topic.
Thank you, Chris. And I have to say, this is a great honor to be able to come before, introduce Carolyn and Glenn, good friends, and just clear-eyed tech aficionados that actually see the policy issues and what their repercussions are. And they've just been great over the years, staying out of the hype waves that have often been propagated by those that want to seek an advantage. So I'm super happy that this conversation is happening, and I recommend this book. Download it for free, or if you like paper like me, you can get it that way too.
Thanks, Brewster. So with that, then, here to introduce our speakers and set the stage for today's discussion is Dave Hansen. Dave is the Executive Director of Authors Alliance, our partners in these sessions.
Hi, everyone. I think this will be a really good talk today. I've been excited about this one for a while. Caroline shared the draft of this book with me back in, I guess it was October or November, and I got a sneak peek, and it's really, really good. And I think especially in a moment when we're just inundated with hype, and I think hype on both sides. There's the sort of AI doomer crowd that, the Skynet is coming and the world's going to end. And then on the other side of the ledger, we've got the technology company folks and other enthusiasts that are giving us the alternative view. And I just really appreciate that this is a level-headed, really, really thoughtful review of what we're really looking at when we're talking about AI. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers and then hand it over to them so that we can hear what they have to say. So first, I'm going to introduce Glyn Moody, who's a London-based technology writer. He's the author of the book Rebel Code, Linux and the Open Source Revolution. He writes widely, and he's appeared in Wired and Computer Weekly and Linux Journal and Ars Technica and probably many others that I have missed. His most recent project, or the most recent project that I've really been engaged with and reading, is entitled Walled Culture. So Glenn actually did a book talk with us, I guess it was several years ago now, talking about walled culture. It has a fantastic website and blog keeping up with essentially what has happened over the last 20, 30, really 50 years, a long, long journey of culture becoming more and more walled off and difficult to gain access to. So very excited to have Glenn with us. And he'll be in conversation with Caroline. And Caroline, I have the pleasure of talking with every couple of weeks. And she's just a wonderful person and has a longtime strategist at the intersection of technology, law, and AI governance. She is based in Belgium and really understands at a deep, deep level EU and global digital policy. And she really specializes in translating some of the complex issues in AI and media and copyright into things that actually make sense and matter to policymakers. So I learned this about her. I didn't know Caroline has lived in 11 countries across 4 continents. And so she brings a real global perspective that I think is unique. So I'm very excited to hear her talk about her book, AI Tools, Not Gods. And so I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Dave, and also Chris and Brewster. And Caroline, hello. It's good to see you again. We've worked together on a number of projects, but this one's entirely your own, and I think it looks really splendid. I really enjoyed reading this book. I also had a sneak preview before it was actually published because it's such a different book from all of the others that have been published about AI. I mean, everyone's been jumping on the AI bandwagon, but there's no other book quite like this because it focuses very much on policy. And that's something that's quite unusual in this world where people tend to be caught up by that hype. But before we get into the details of the really interesting way you've addressed that, I'd just like to ask you a more general question about your experience in the AI world. Most people think that AI is something new and possibly exciting, but in fact, it's been around for over half a century. And I wondered when you first came across the idea, how your views on it changed, particularly with the latest round of LLMs, the large language models, and the generative AI that is really driving the current sort of excitement around AI.
Yeah, so I think I've been aware of AI for a very long time, although it didn't fall under that sexy term for a long time when I was dealing with it. It was, text and data mining, machine learning, a lot less exciting in terms of terminology. And to me, what triggered me into writing the book and feeling the need to talk about it was just the fact that everything was AI and nothing was AI at some point in the conversation I was having with policymakers. And if you're in Brussels, which is the capital of policymaking in the EU, I mean, if there's one thing we produce a lot of in Brussels, it's legislation and policy. And you're talking to people and they are talking about mathematics and applied statistics in a way that makes you think, are they really understanding what's happening here? Then that's worrisome. And so I wasn't a specialist in AI back then. I did take a small online course at MIT to understand a bit what was under the hood, but I'm not a mathematician like you, Glyn. So I wanted to understand, when people talk about AI, what does that actually mean and what does it cover? And once I started going into it and reading more and more out of it, I kind of came to a point where I thought, okay, I'm either going to become Homer Simpson's dad, like the old man going outside and shouting at clouds out of frustration, or if I want to look really intelligent, I'm going to write a book about it and try to go through an exercise of understanding. The difficulty, I think, at the moment, and I was looking before we started, I was looking at some of the reactions that people had on social media to the announcement of the talk, is that AI has been decreased. The understanding that people have of AI at the moment is extremely limited, and it's limited to a number of very visible use cases, which are the chatbots, which are generative AI, and within generative AI, an even smaller proportion of generative AI, which is the chat GPTs, the Geminis, the Claudes of this world. And so a lot of the conversations on AI it come from that point of view. You're thinking about a chatbot producing an averagely exciting email response, a mediocre piece of, I won't say art, but a mediocre graphic, or an averagely funny song on Suno or something. That's what a lot of people are thinking about when they talk AI. And that's where they then say sometimes very emotional things and push for some emotional actions by policymakers. When I think of AI, I see a breadth of possibilities, and I see a lot of applications that are happening that have nothing to do with ChatGPT, thank God. And that, I always say, non-threatening to, for example, a Sir Elton John when he produces music, because I don't think he's folding proteins in his kitchen as some of the DeepMind applications in AI, for example, do. So yeah, language at the end of the day is the biggest difficulty at the moment. I think in policymaking, in general conversation, in reporting of the media, there is a lot of sloppiness in language when talking about AI. Some of it is on purpose. When you look at the Silicon Valley people and the marketing spin and the hype, that language and the use of language and the fact of making it look like some magic that's going to change the world, solve all problems, that's done on purpose. And that is done because when you're asking for 500 billion, 1 trillion, whatever enormous amount of investment, you can't say, well, it's just to improve my chatbot to become slightly less sycophantic and slightly more accurate. You have to announce that you're doing something, that's wonderful and that will change the world for that amount of money. And then sadly, as I said, with Silicon Valley, I see where they're coming from. Might not agree with it, but okay. But sadly, then it gets into the press that just, in many cases, just repeats what was said by one tech brew or another without challenging it very much or without pushing back on it. Or when they do so, it's in the article in paragraph 7, which is where people never scroll down on their phone type of place.
Your book has some very interesting ideas, very detailed ideas about this essential problem of stories. So perhaps you could say a little bit about the stories that you've identified within the AI world.
First of all, it's not new. The fact that, technology has a lot of stories around it, and we had that with the internet, the Wild West, the information superhighway. There was a lot of terminology, there were metaphors, there were stories. The interesting thing with artificial intelligence is that a lot of the stories on AI existed before the technology was even there, or at least before it even realized its potential. So we've had sci-fi movies, sci-fi books about, overlords taking control and robots taking over, and all of that has been in our, imagination when machine learning was still very, very nascent and wasn't at all sophisticated back in the days. And I've tried to classify the type of stories in 4 myths, let's say, which are magic, madness, heaven, and sin. The magic one is the most, I think everyone has realized that they're trying to sell AI as magic. And I talk about the sparkle emoji that is used often to refer. There's a lot of little stars every time you look at the user interface for artificial intelligence, how it's produced. And that is, their way of pushing like, ooh, something amazing is happening. Even though the something amazing in many cases is just a parrot that is predicting a string of tokens that look like a sentence and that they hope will respond to whatever query you have at that time. But it sounds cooler if you say it's magic and it has intelligence and, is sentient, obviously. So that's kind of on the magic side, like making it look like it's coming to life. It's using all of the anthropomorphic language, like it thinks, it believes. Recently, we had Anthropic issued a constitution for Claude, the chatbot, where it was talking about the emotions and how that thing that they are programming should react to its emotions, etc., which was the biggest piece of anthropomorphization I've ever seen in my life. And I should add, the constitution had people from the Roman Catholic clergy involved in its writing, which I'm not sure that's the best way to get ethics going into anything, but, why not? And I was actually disappointed when I read that because I thought the Anthropic people were amongst the more controlled one or the more shy ones in terms of making bold statements. But I guess, when you have an IPO lurking, you suddenly write a constitution. Would be my guess that that's the timing of it. But then you have the madness one. And the madness one is really that whole, arms race type of mentality that has been created. And it's an arms race between continents. Like, USA wants to be quicker than China. Europe is vaguely making announcements that they want to do their thing too. There's a geopolitical dimension to the race. But then there's a dimension of, couple of big companies wanting to outrace each other and make the announcement of my chatbot is better than yours, bigger than yours, quicker than yours, I guess, type of statement. And in both of those races, those are actually quite threatening in terms of policy making. Because when you create a constant state of emergency, of urgency for everyone, like on the market, policymakers start doing shortcuts. And the shortcuts can be actually in both extremes. They can be shortcuts about, let's not regulate anything, let's not legislate anything because we want to be quicker than the other guy. We don't want to be outpaced by China. And so, whoops, let them do whatever they want and we'll just see what happens, which is not a great thing to do for any technology or any human behavior. It's just, it's like basically you take your kid and you throw it in the playground and say, do whatever and we'll see what comes out of it. And then you have the other extreme, which is, what comes from the doomers more, which is to say, we need to regulate the hell out of this and push the pause button on AI, whatever AI is, because this is going out of control. The good thing, I think, is Europe did adopt something called the EU AI Act. And when that started, actually, it was reasonably okay in terms of act because it had the intelligence of not looking initially too much at the technology, but it looked at the outcome. It looked at the behavior. So it kind of classified AI according to the level of risk, like high risk, medium risk, which made sense, I think. That was a reasonably good way of looking at it and saying, okay, when it's in a military drone, that's high risk. When it's filtering your spam, we're reasonably okay with it. And anything in the middle, we'll see how we address it. The problem is that good intention and that good classification that started in Europe then went into complete overdrive once actually ChatGPT got released during the negotiations of the EU AI Act, and they seemed to discover generative AI in Brussels. And then they started micromanaging the whole thing by putting more and more and more and more details in the act, which is now 180 pages of monstrosity and is already starting to be relooked at because some of the provisions are considered as not appropriate anymore with the evolution of AI. And that leads me to the fact that policymakers and legislators are extremely bad at regulating technology because they don't understand technology. They shouldn't be expected to understand technology. And even when they understand technology, they can't predict technology. Because honestly, if you could predict technology, you would probably not be a policymaker. You'd be working at a venture capitalist and making a whole lot of money. So what I hope that policymakers will do more and more moving forward and looking at these challenges of technology evolving quite rapidly is regulate behavior. Because the outcomes of technology are what I call behavior, and they are really predictable. What people do with AI is the usual stuff you do without AI, which is you cheat, you scam, you lie. And what the people that make AI do is the usual stuff that any company that has a competitive edge or that has a gatekeeping position does, which is you kind of abuse your dominant position in any which way you can. And those are all very traditional ways of doing things. They're not very motivated by technology. And then looking at my two other myths that I looked at, which are heaven and sin, I'm really intrigued at the level of, how should I put it, godlike language, rituals, religious type of vibe you get out of the whole AI discussions, out of the presentations that are done around their products. I mean, we've had that in the past on technology, like, the Apple or meetings, TEDx type of talks, the light setting, the way they speak, no questions. You have to listen to the evangelists that are basically bringing technology to you. So it's been happening for some time, but with AI, it's kind of sped up. As I said, a constitution, clergy giving their opinion on the ethics. There's a lot of dimensions here that are a bit weird, to be quite honest, and that merits to just be shrugged away a bit, and people thought should be told to kind of get a grip because, to a large extent at this stage, to my knowledge, AI is a very sophisticated calculator. And, if you're going to bow to the religion of a calculator, that's worrisome and that's on you. And then the last one, the most worrying one in terms of policy making, is the sin one. The sin myth. So it's basically blame everything on AI. Major layoffs are being done by companies. Those are AI layoffs. Creators are under pressure and it's very difficult to have an income. Blame it on AI. Anything that you can see, any problem, kids are having difficulties in remembering things, their attention span is decreasing, blame it on AI. I'm not saying AI doesn't have a role in any of those things, but usually all of those problems are a bit more complex than that. And they have their origins in societal problems, in things not having been resolved by governments or by companies beforehand. And it's just very convenient to blame it on AI, but that's not the reality. There's been studies recently that actually a lot of the AI has been used as an excuse, for example, for major layoffs in certain companies, but it's not because those jobs have been displaced by people or by AI taking over the functions. It was just a good way of saying, oh, let's remove the people that we hired. There was a bit of overhiring, for example, in tech for a couple of years, and now they're kind of solving that. And maybe people should think that stock markets that value more decrease of headcount than looking at other expenditures, maybe it's those stock markets that have a problem more than AI causing the problem. So there's a lot of things where they just point at AI as something very convenient, but where the reality is not such. And what is really worrisome is the use of AI did this or AI did that. Because AI doesn't do anything. AI is a software that was programmed by humans. So, for example, when in Europe we recently had a big, how should I put it, we had a lot of emotions come out because of how Grok behaved with deepfakes of women, of nudes without consent of women on the X platform by generating those deepfakes. And a lot of the headlines were Grok did this or Grok did that. And like, no, Elon Musk created a software that allowed people to do that. And so at one end, you have Elon Musk, and at the other end, you have human beings, mostly men, doing things that are despicable. Saying Grok did something, that's a really convenient way to remove any accountability on both ends of that chain. And I think that's the biggest thing. In the use of our language, we need to try and remove the AI word as much as we can and to point towards who's accountable in doing these things.
I mean, this analysis seems to me, a very powerful way of looking at this complex situation. And I know that you talk to policymakers in Brussels, particularly, a lot. So I'm sure you've been saying some of these things too. And do they acknowledge this when you speak to them, or are they just completely baffled by it? I mean, how is this going down in the sort of centers of power, do you think?
I think the problem is policymakers get asked all the time to do something about it. Do something about this or that. And in this case now, there's a lot of ick feeling towards AI. A lot of people are just like, ugh, don't like it, don't like what it's doing to my kids, don't like what it's doing to creativity, don't like this. Do something about it. And it's very difficult for policymakers. I always say legislators legislate, regulators regulate. I mean, so if you come to a legislator and you tell them do something about it, the first thing they think is, well, we'll do a new law. Where often my instinct to tell them is maybe you should enforce the ones you already have, because in a lot of cases, you're not enforcing anything at the moment. So there's that sense of we need to respond to people asking us to do something. There's also a sense of surely it can't be that simple that we just regulate behavior without specifying what was used. And I always tell them, well, I don't know, if you say thou shalt not kill and you don't specify with AI or with a spoon, the thou shalt not kill should apply reasonably well, regardless of what you use. So why is it so difficult to accept that you need to take your hands away from technology and just look at behavior? And then I think there is, even amongst policymakers, there is a kind of policy race in terms of, I've produced my act before you, my act looks better than yours. I mean, Brussels has this thing with the Brussels effect. They're so proud of having produced the first privacy legislation and the GDPR, and that having influenced a lot of other countries. And, good on them, because initially the privacy legislation was actually quite good. It became a bit more difficult to comply with as time went by because they micromanaged again. But since that, they have this thing like, ooh, we're not good at producing AI companies, but we're going to produce the first legislation that installs guardrails. And I think in the US, it's a bit the opposite extreme to a certain extent at federal level. There, it's more like, ooh, we will be the first one to do absolutely nothing about AI and just let it go. I would say, thank God you have the state level that then intervenes and maybe adds a bit more safety into the whole thing. But they were starting to get a grip on what AI was and wasn't, and starting, I think, to see like, okay, some of it is generative AI and chatbots, some of it is stuff that could be useful for medicine, some of it could go into industrial type of applications for agriculture. And what was a recent case I saw, improving how beer crates at Carlsberg are being shipped or whatever, So they were starting to see the building blocks of AI as being a bit more complex than just ChatGPT. And suddenly we had Moldbook and Clawbot and all of those things with agentic AI popping up. And guess what policymakers are doing in Brussels this week. They're looking at agentic AI to see how they could regulate that. So every time there's a new shiny little thing popping up, they have to do something.
Okay, I mean, you described there well the sad state of reality in these circumstances. So let's just talk about a hypothetical situation where, I don't know, let's make you the commissioner, EU commissioner for AI. In an ideal world, how should we address the regulation of AI without making those same kind of mistakes?
Well, I mean, there's three keys that I identify in my book, which is accountability, proportionality, and durability. And so on accountability, it's looking at who benefits from AI and making sure that when you regulate, you try to go after the people that benefit from AI's lack of guardrails or lack of safety or whatever, and make sure that you go after them. So target your regulation to the right people. In terms of proportionality, that's a bit the system that the EU AI Act has, which is like look at the risks of the different types of AI and regulate accordingly in terms of like leaving some of it to normal legislation. We have a lot of legislation in Europe, and the US has a lot of legislation sectorial and at state level to protect consumers, etc. Just use that legislation for new technologies. And the durability part is that part where you don't look at technology, but you look at behavior. So you don't have to change your legislation every time there's a change in terminology. And so basically, one of the examples I give in my book is the US Wire Act that has been looking at fraud through wire originally, but has adapted as technology moved to also address internet, social media, and it keeps on finding a new life for itself in terms of regulating bad behavior. And I think we need to have more approaches like that. In Europe, we had something called, well, we still have it, the e-commerce directive that was adopted over 2 decades ago. That was a lovely piece of legislation, 5 pages long, 5 pages, the articles. And it allowed the whole of the internet to flourish in Europe. And it actually had kind of an incentive approach to people behaving properly on the internet, let's say, without too much interference, rather than, let's try to micromanage every type of bad behavior. That directive is still in application and still functions. And the reason it functioned is because they tried to legislate a behavior, e-commerce. They weren't trying to do the internet directive. They weren't trying to, legislate a full ecosystem of things happening that are very different depending on how you look at the internet. So I think there's more of that needs to happen. So more at a high level legislate, but then put more money into enforcement. Because every time I hear people go about Wild West anything when it comes to technology, the interpretation of legislators is, oh, we need to do more rules. But if you look at every Western movie, the central piece is the sheriff. It's not the judge, usually, or the legislator. I mean, they're not very much into Western movies. You don't see the legislator coming into the movies. The sheriff is there, he has a gun, and he looks mean when you're not behaving. We don't have a lot of sheriffs in Europe, for example, that are actually going after companies that misbehave or people that misbehave. And in some cases, I think it's a lack of willingness, and in some cases, it's a lack of funding. But I think there needs to be a bit more enforcement in making sure that all of the rules that are there already get applied to the companies and to the people that misbehave. And then we need judges that understand technology, because that is a difficult one on AI. At the moment, we've had very differing court cases between, for example, the UK on copyright and AI and training data, and Germany, just because I think in the UK, the procedure meant that the judge had experts come and explain to him how AI functioned. And I think he made a decent judgment based on that, because someone came and told him, well, this is the way the thing functions. And he went like, oh, okay. In Germany, they didn't. The judge kind of went like, hey, I understand AI. It's like a photocopying machine. Let's go for it. And then you have very different results, which do not create trust in the judicial process because it's just like, okay, that's all over the place. So I think if we could invest less money in creating new laws and put more money into enforcing the ones that are out there and allowing like tech geeky people to be employed into enforcement agencies and in courts, I think that would be a really nice move.
Okay. So turning this around then and just looking at what might happen if we don't do some of those things. I mean, what do you fear might happen if we carry on doing what we're doing at the moment?
I think we'll be one step behind the companies every time. Because at the moment, as I said, we legislate AI, we discover LLMs and the most narrow output of an LLM, which is a chatbot. And then we discover agentic AI. And every time we jump on it and we try to, patch it or do something like that, some piece of legislation that is ad hoc, that doesn't look at the bigger picture. And I think because we will be running behind every development, the companies, looking at it as a European, the companies that are in other geographies will just continue deploying whatever they feel like deploying, and the right questions will not be asked and the right safeguards will not be asked. For example, I still do not understand what the public interest value is in creating a clone of a human. What are we trying to achieve by creating something that replaces us? I mean, is any one of us happy with that? Is anyone looking to be replaced or have a replacement? I can see a lot of really useful uses of AI that are not that, and I'd like to see a lot of money go to that. But I'm not sure that the replacement of a human is like something that society is screaming for. I can see why some companies are screaming for it, and I certainly can see why the military would enjoy it, but I don't see why society as such would be looking for that, for example. Also, I think one of the big things that is not well understood maybe by the public is the amount of money that's being poured into AI is not just worrisome because it means that there's a hype cycle and that there's an inflation, the value of AI is being exaggerated. And, there's this circle of money going from one AI company to another, like in a Three Stooges type of gig that, you get my money, I get your money, I give your money, I promise you my money, and we go back again type of thing. That is worrisome. And the fact that the GDP of the US, the GDP growth of the US is totally dependent at the moment on AI is also worrisome. But even if you don't look at that, the biggest problem I find is that there's no money for other things. All the money is going into anything that has AI on it. And there's a lot of very nice brick and mortar type of initiatives and other things that are not happening at the moment because there's no money for those. It doesn't fit what venture capitalists or what investors want to invest in, because if it doesn't say .ai, it's not interesting at the moment, or they can't justify it. And I think there are actions that can be done that are even not legislative, but that are driven by legislators or policymakers to say, well, no, we're not going to invest in the biggest data servers that will dry out every piece of water that we can think of. I think that there needs to be a grown-up reaction of saying, okay, how much bigger or how many LLMs do we need to produce that are gigantic and whatever? And can we compare that to the benefits of AI that is focused, like small language models, targeted type of applications to improve certain things? As I said, agriculture. There's a lot of fields where you can try to tackle some of the problems of climate change, of predictions of droughts and flooding, and how do you address it? How can you automate things better so that help is there and things like that? But obviously that's not as sexy as having version 4.501 of some chatbot come out that can now make the images more glossy or something. But so I'm afraid at the moment people are so excited about every little new shiny thing, and when I say people, that includes legislators, that, yeah, we're going to be running behind the facts if we continue to do it that way.
And so picking up on that issue of whether we're in a bubble, I won't ask you to answer the question of whether we are in a bubble or all that might happen. But again, hypothetically, I think it's worth exploring what might happen if we had a catastrophic crash of the AI market. How would that change things, both in terms of what people did and also in terms of what, for example, the policy should be?
I mean, are we in a bubble? Yes, I think That's an easy one. Will the bubble burst like it did with anything with an E in front of it in the past? We had that moment. I mean, I hope not to a certain extent, because it will be painful for society as a whole, not just for the people that are doing AI. But I think it's likely that something will happen. You can't burn cash at the rate that those companies are burning cash without at some point expecting a stock market reaction of some sort. I imagine they're all betting on the fact that they will be too big to fail type of thing, like the banks did in the past.
It works out so well when they take that attitude that they're too big to fail.
Well, I mean, most companies repeat playbooks that they saw work for some in the past. So, I mean, there's very little originality in big companies' behavior. That's why I say it's really easy to regulate behavior. They always use the same playbook. But I think the most worrying thing is, should the bubble burst, it will affect everyone, because it will affect all the banks and the investors that have poured money into AI, in terms of not being able to invest in other things afterwards, or give you a loan, or, do the normal things that they should be doing. Honestly, when I was writing the book, I finished writing my book like in October. And my publicist then said, because I wanted to release it, because I was like, okay, I'm tired of this. I've been updating it every month because they keep on inventing new bizarre things and whatever. Can I get it out? And then I discovered that books are like cars. They have a year. And so you can't release a book that is a nonfiction book at the end of a year. You have to wait until the beginning of the next year. And when that happened, I was like, oh God, I hope the bubble doesn't burst while I'm waiting, because then I have to rewrite the whole book. So it was that bad. But yeah, I think the problem is, when you see the US economy being so reliant on AI and on that money flow around AI, it is worrying if the bubble should burst. I mean, the impact on, and anything that impacts the US impacts the rest of the world. I mean, it's not like Europe is not dependent on how the economy in the US goes. We sadly are.
I mean, you've mentioned how politicians tend to be susceptible to shiny things. AI being the latest one. Do you get any sense that they are seriously thinking about what they should do if the bubble does burst?
I mean, not in Brussels, certainly. In Brussels, we're just busy with building gigafactories for AI, so that we can compete and have our digital sovereignty and our independence from the US. So we're in that same gold rush. We're just later and a bit more complicated and multilingual in doing it. But it's the same. It's the real estate people and the NVIDIAs and the chip makers that are, selling the shovels for the gold rush at the moment, and that are making a lot of money. Will we end up with a lot of empty data centers at some point? I certainly hope not. But yeah, no, at the moment it's all building and trying to catch up with the rest of the world. In Europe, I don't know. I think they've promised so much with AI that it's very difficult to suddenly say, hey, psych, it was a joke. Actually, it's not that amazing. We actually had the case that in the State of the Union of the President of the European Commission this year, she actually said that AGI could be expected in the next couple of years, which led to 150 scientists writing an open letter saying, really? I mean, they said it in a lot more scientific way, obviously, but really was the message. So yeah, I think at the moment they're as caught up in the hype to a certain extent than the rest of us. And, we had Davos recently in Europe, where that was a continuous platform of AI hype in every shape or form that you could imagine. You even had a dialogue between DeepMind and Anthropic about, AGI in 5 years. No, I think 2. And you're thinking, like, did anyone define artificial general intelligence in that conversation? No, no one did.
Thank you for such a good conversation. Caroline, given your experience globally, there's a lot in the book that touches on US policy and that touches on EU policy. One of the narratives that we hear, though, is, so much of policy is being driven by kind of the lowest common denominator, right? The race towards like, well, China's going to do it anyways, so we better just get there first. How do you respond to that?
I mean, first of all, I think surprisingly, China is doing it in a very non-hype way, AI. They're being very kind of, using it in their industry. They're using it to make paying for your parking easier. They're using it in the least sexy way, but probably the most efficient way and the most tools way that you can imagine. Same thing with how they release, models in open source and how they're doing things. That they're taking a very different approach to Europe and the US, which would be very interesting to adopt if it wasn't China producing it and you're not really sure if you want to install these things on your computer. And I think, because you mentioned China, you mentioned the US, and you mentioned the EU, I think the global majority, the rest of the world, actually have very different perceptions also of AI. First of all, some of the geographies are the people that are doing AI. A lot of the AI labeling, monitoring of chats, going through training data, cleaning up all of that stuff, that's all happening, in the global majority, let's say. Waymo cars are being reviewed by people in the Philippines. It's their perception of AI, I think, is a very different one. It could be one where they say, yay, great, we have jobs, except they're paid very poorly to do these tasks, and some of these tasks are no fun to do. On the other hand, there's also a lot of success stories in Africa, in Asia. There are applications of AI that are lovely. For example, in countries that have a history of oral storytelling, not written storytelling, there are now AI applications being rolled out by research centers to try and preserve that oral history through AI and to keep that alive. So there are nice stories too. But at the moment, I think the difficulty is I'm still not always sure why there is that whole rush on building the biggest thing that is bigger than the other guy and that will do AGI. I still have not seen a convincing case of why we're building AGI.
I mean, historically on the internet, if you get there first and you get there building the biggest, most successful one, you dominate that market. And so it seems to me there's a feeling that there's going to be huge riches, but not for many people. So we have to be the biggest and best quickly to dominate that new market, and then we're made. I mean, I think it's a continuation of the kind of internet model that people see. I mean, I agree, not necessarily true, but I think that seems to be the thinking.
So one of the themes that I think you see across the technology industry over the last 20, 30 years that I don't think any regulators have gotten quite right is how to deal with consolidation and concentration of market power. So right now we have a handful of really big AI companies, and there are relatively few tools, relatively few of these kind of frontier labs. What's the policy solution for that? We've seen things that don't work well. We have a lot of experience in, not fixing that. And so is there a way to kind of get that right in the AI space where we haven't gotten it right in social media or web search or other technological advancements over the last 20 or 30 years?
I mean, it's a complex question because how are these gatekeeping positions created? And they are created on the basis of multiple factors. A first factor, which is very difficult to counterbalance, is leveraging your dominance in one market on another one, which is, happening, for example, with Google and its AI functions. It has access to so much data that no one else has access to, that it can leverage that very easily in AI. And on top of that, they have, their own equivalent to GPUs that they can build. I mean, there's a lot of things that they've done in the past that are really easy to leverage into this market seamlessly, which even others of their competitors do not have. So that's one thing. The second thing is the fact that, and now I'm talking as a European, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness type of mentality that US companies have and that European companies don't have, mean that US companies actually build things a lot quicker than we do, because we're still checking, the third law to see how we should comply with it, while you guys have already rolled it out. And that means, again, that US companies kind of have a foothold much quicker on the markets than Europeans have. And then the third thing, I think, in terms of how they create that dominance is the narrative, is by saying, this AGI thing is really, it's dangerous. It's going to be something that is going to be very difficult to handle. It might take over we might not be able to pull the plug. So you need to make sure that it's not in the hands of everyone, but only in an elite of people that can handle it, which is, by the way, exactly how the Atoms for Peace program was rolled out and sold. Like, it's only a selected few of really important people that should handle this because it's really dangerous and could affect the whole world, type of thing. So that's how they get that position. How do you take them out of that position? Well, I don't know. Maybe you should force more open into whatever they do. And I don't mean, claiming you're open source, but being open source, because there's a nuance. So maybe forcing them to put more of their data that they maybe took from the commons to give it more back to the commons, for example. Maybe also in terms of their algorithms, their data. I'm not saying that they need to share trade secrets with people or whatever, but I think there is a level of things that they could easily share with the market that would allow others to develop their own solutions, if not as big foundational models, but as smaller applications. And then I think at some point, maybe removing some of the ties that allow them to leverage all of that stuff from one place to another, that's going to be needed. But the biggest problem I think we have at the moment is most of the enforcers, when it comes to dominant market position, most of the enforcement incentive or impetus comes from Europe, but it relates to American companies, which are not easy for us to go after. And at the moment, geopolitically, with the relationship between the US and Europe being what it is, a lot of policymakers are not willing to go after American companies because suddenly we might not be able to export our cheese. That's the level we're at the moment, sadly, in terms of policy making.
You mentioned open source, which is obviously something I'm interested in, not least because I wrote the book Rebel Code, as you kindly mentioned. And it's striking that in China, open source is very much the norm. Obviously, as Caroline says, people claim to be open source when they're only minimally so. You really need open source, open weights, and far more information. And the other side of the thing is that in some ways, the software isn't the hard bit. It's the training on the data that's the hard bit. And you have to get the data. And it seems to be one of the big mistakes Europe in particular is making is that we're letting big companies have the data. Like in the UK, we're basically giving access to the NHS data, the National Health Service data, which is one of the most important stores of data in the world. And I think European countries in particular appreciate how important, how valuable that data is. And it shouldn't be just handed over for sort of minimal sums. I mean, it is the core property that is needed for these systems, so they should be valued as such.
Thank you both. And especially this ending piece, I'm very interested in this. And I'm a big believer that, openness is an incredible antidote to market power abuse. So I think that's a really important point to end on. Chris, I will hand it over to you.
For thank yous, a thank you to Caroline and Glyn for a great conversation, to Brewster for the foreword and the little context setting at the top here, and to Dave Hansen and Authors Alliance for facilitating and for co-hosting these sessions. Thanks. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.